Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to our Knowledge at Noon program. My name is Jenna Harris and I am the Education Manager for YOLO Arts. Just a reminder, please go ahead and mute your microphone and your video. This will help us preserve bandwidth to ensure a smooth streaming experience for everyone joining us today. If you are joining us on a computer, we do recommend selecting the speaker view under your meeting menu. That way you can take advantage of our full presentation today. It is a visual presentation of photographs. So I highly recommend making sure that you're under that speaker view. And if you're joining us by phone, you can do that same thing by clicking more and adjusting your view under there. So Knowledge at Noon is our free monthly speaker series here, where we feature professionals that explore themes central to YOLO Arts and YOLO County Historical Collection exhibitions at the Gibson House and property. Some housekeeping announcements to make. We are at the Gibson House looking for garden volunteers. So our Gibson gardeners need some help with propagation and garden maintenance. If you have a green thumb or an interest in gardening or helping out or even learning about these things, please check out our website, yoloarts.org, and submit a volunteer application. We would love to have you join us. Also happening here on the property, tomorrow we will be having a barn gallery opening. The Art Farm show will be opening up from 5:30 to 8 at 6:30 p.m. Our guest judge for the show, Natalie Nelson, who is our guest judge this year. She's also the director of the Pence Gallery in Davis. She will be announcing the exhibition award winners at 6:30 p.m. And we will also be having outdoor live music by Jimmy Ashley. Again, this is tomorrow evening. Please come on by the property. Also happening tomorrow, tickets for our annual Art Farm fundraiser go on sale. The fundraiser this year is happening on October 16th, and we'll be at the Gibson House property outdoors this year in the afternoon. So it's going to be really exciting. I'm excited for our new venue this year. Personally, I love anything outside, so I think it's going to be a great place to showcase our agriculture and art explorations of the county. Also happening tomorrow is the bidding for the silent auction open. So you can come by, you can see the show, see what's on view, and go ahead and snag those silent auction pieces in advance. Also on view at Gallery 625 is our Suite exhibition, and that has been extended through November. So you've got extra time to check that out, and I recommend doing so. Again, this is a lot of information, a lot of things happening. All of this can be found on our website at yoloarts.org. Okay. Awesome. Thank you so much. So nice to have everyone today. Before we get started, I do want to introduce our Knowledge at Noon speaker. We are joined today by Mel Russell. Mel was born in London, England in 1948. In 1970, she graduated with a double major in history and physical education from Digby Stuart College, London. Prior to starting her teaching career, she took some time off to travel around the world. And while in San Francisco, she met her husband, Michael, and of course, the rest is history. Mel has worked various jobs in the retail industry with an emphasis on inventory control, visual displays, and customer relations. And for 8 years, she owned her own store in Sonoma. After taking an early retirement, lucky Mel, she joined the Yolo County Library and in 2000 was appointed to the Yolo County Archive and Records Center Coordinator, where she served for 10 years. And since 2014, Mel has been volunteering for the Lest We Forget project, which commemorates Yolo County's participation in the First World War. She especially enjoys illuminating national history in this way, telling the story of how ordinary citizens of Yolo were caught up in the seminal events of the 20th century, the Great War, the war to end all wars that still casts its long shadow over the world today. So Mel, with that, I'd like to say welcome and turn it over to you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. So, a minute. Ooh, there we go. Sorry. Thank you. So I'll get right to it. Honoring the unknown soldier. October 24th, 1921, four identical caskets containing the remains of four unknown American soldiers exhumed from four different cemeteries in France, waited in a makeshift chapel in the City Hall of Chalon-sur-Marne. Outside, 6 American Army pallbearers were assembled, each fearing that they may be the ones selected to choose the unknown soldier. That fate fell upon Sergeant Edward Younger. He himself had helped to bury the bodies of hundreds of his buddies under fire on the very same battlefield where each of these 4 men had fallen. In awe of the moment, he entered the dark chapel and said that when alone, the tragedy and horror of war impressed themselves more forcibly on him than at any other time of his service in France, even though he had seen men falling like leaves from shrapnel and machine gun fire. Given a large bouquet of roses to place on his selection, he walked around the coffins, each draped with a beautiful American flag. He walked around 3 times, touching each coffin, until he made his choice, the second casket on his right. He said, "It was as though something had pulled me. Something seemed to stop me each time I passed the coffin. As I moved towards it, the mysterious pull grew irresistible. I could not have turned back now had I tried. A voice seemed to say, 'This is a pal of yours.'" And indeed, during battle, bodies were buried where they lay by their own comrades in arms, by their pals. The row of crosses here are the graves of men of the 363rd Regiment, buried where they fell after being machine gunned down by Germans from the slope above. Shortly after battle, Labor and pioneer regiments, mainly made up of African Americans, would disinter the bodies and rebury them in trenches like this one, creating row after row of white crosses until there were over 700 temporary American cemeteries. Incredibly, America had gone to war with no official policy regarding the burial or repatriation of the dead. The impossibility of returning over 77,000 bodies in various levels of decomposition had brought up fundamental questions. Should the dead be buried with their comrades in arms, where they had shed their blood for democracy? Or should they be brought home to be buried in the family plot? By 1919, this situation was driving the debate over the rights and ownership of the war dead. Who owned the body of a serviceman? The military or the family? Parents had assumed and had been reassured that their loved ones would all be returned to them. A shockwave of anguish went through America when next of kin were asked to decide by ballot postcards where their relatives' final resting place should be. In France, at Arlington National Cemetery or at home. In the end, 70% of families chose to have their loved ones returned to the United States. And yet, that left over 33,000 bodies, including the unidentified, to be disinterred once again and reburied in 8 designated permanent American cemeteries scattered throughout Europe. This meant that there were thousands of Americans, and in particular mothers, who would have no place to mourn for their dead. Recognizing this congressman, former Major Hamilton Fish, seen here on the right, and others introduced Public Resolution number 67 in order to bring home the body of an unknown American warrior who in himself represents no section, creed, or race in the late war, and who typifies, moreover, the soul of America and the supreme sacrifice of her heroic dead. Major Fish, who had served with the African American Combat Unit, the famous 369th, the Harlem Hellfighters, wanted to create a unifying place where all those who served would be honored. The truth was that the selection process almost guaranteed that the soldier would be white and almost certainly Christian. An important element in the politics of creating the tomb was its location. Cities in the East vied with each other for the privilege of housing the remains of the hero. Arlington National Cemetery, with its strong Southern connection, having belonged to Robert E. Lee's wife's family, and containing large numbers of Confederate dead, was not the obvious choice. And if you look at the top right corner, you'll see a circle, if you look closely, a circle with a monument, and that is the Confederate dead memorial in 1919. It was also in a relatively isolated location, but it was the new amphitheater shown in this picture from 1919 that persuaded Congress to select Arlington. The tomb was to be placed at the front of the building by the balustrades. And the task, the honor of constructing the tomb, was given to this group of African American laborers. In France, the task of honoring the unknown was given to American and French soldiers who stood guard over the flag-draped coffin with a bouquet of flowers laid on top. The flowers would travel with the remains and be buried with the body, now housed in a special black coffin engraved with an unknown American who gave his life in the World War. All records associated with the 4 unknown candidates were destroyed. The 3 unchosen were taken that evening to the Meuse Argonne Cemetery, where they were buried in graves number 1, 2, and 3, row 1, block G, as simply 3 unknowns. There was no mention of their disinterment, their non-selection, and consequent reburial. And so the long journey of repatriation began by train to Le Havre, and then by ship aboard the USS Olympia, guarded by Marines throughout. The journey involved sailing through a major storm with cyclone winds, mountainous waves, and driving rain. The chaplain on board told the worried crew that with the hand of God, he, the unknown, he will be delivered home to the people of America. And we can take a moment to think if the boat had actually sunk, that boy may have been considered to have died twice for his country. On safe arrival at Washington Navy Yard, a solemn ceremony acknowledged the transfer of the body from the Navy to the Army. The remains were then taken to the Capitol, where they lay in state in the rotunda. And on November 10th, 90,000 visitors passed by to pay their respects. On the 11th, a funeral process took place from the rotunda through Washington, D.C. to the new memorial building in Arlington National Cemetery. Walking behind the caisson can just be seen in this picture President Harding, General Pershing, and Chief Justice Taft. And in fact, all the politicians and important people from DC were in the procession. Besides the coffin, walked the honorary pallbearers, all highly decorated veterans of the war, many of them Medal of Honor recipients, one of whom was Captain Whitsley, leader of the Lost Battalion, who was to commit suicide just 2 weeks later. He was thought to have been distraught by the constant reminders of the war and his role in the loss of men under his command, a response to war that the Army still struggles with today. At the amphitheater, President Harding in his speech declared, "This hero unknown is not unhonored," and went on to say, "With all my heart, I wish we might say to the defenders who survive, to mothers who sorrow, to widows and children who mourn, that no such sacrifice shall be asked again." Harding intended the ceremony to be the opening event for the International Conference on the Limitations of Armaments. The inevitable debate over the meaning and purpose of the tomb had begun. But at the pivotal moment of the funeral service, seen here, when General Pershing sprinkled soil from France into the tomb, all present seemed to accept that that soil had been made sacred by the blood and the ultimate sacrifice of this unknown young man. The very last action on the program, a sign perhaps that the tomb would act as a unifying force in the country, was when Chief Plentycoos, representing the Native American Indians of the United States, laid down in blessing his war bonnet and coup stick on the tomb of the unknown, hoping no doubt to bring attention to the over 12,000 Native Americans who had served during the war, many as the original code breakers. The inherent tensions in the politics of mourning will always be associated with the tomb. And so it was from the beginning. Was it a place to mourn, especially for mothers with their special inseparable bond with their children? Was it a place to honor? or was it a place to glorify? By 1923, the military was already questioning the perceived role of the tomb and asking, how can it be made more an inspiration of patriotism rather than sadness? It was felt that a sentry at the tomb would increase its dignity and encourage the proper reverence due to the fallen soldier. After all, families had been known to picnic on the tomb. By 1926, the army was given the privilege of permanently guarding the tomb. The rituals of the sentinel that we all know can be dated back to this moment, this picture, March 25th, 1926, with guard William John Quick protecting the tomb of the unknown. So, a new approach to this place of national remembrance evolved. And by 1931, an actual new physical approach, reflecting that change, had been built in a design heavily influenced by the classical military tradition. The tomb was elevated into a place of patriotic pilgrimage, literally elevated with this long walkway and then this mass of stairs. The tomb was elevated in order to honor the heroes that had died in the Great War. And so it does seem as if the idea of war as noble and uplifting was supplanting the idea of war as tragic and as unendurably sad. A new sarcophagus was placed upon the tomb, and if you look the lower part here, the lower part is the tomb, and the marble sarcophagus sits upon it, decorated with 6 wreaths to represent the 6 major campaigns that American troops had fought in. On the front, a relief sculpture now showed victory with his sword, peace reaching out to him with an olive branch, but also holding hands with valor, representing America's strong and enduring ties with her wartime allies. And with the outbreak of World War II, Americans were soon called upon to support many of the same allies again. By 1941, the tomb had been incorporated into the body of America's psyche enough to be used as a backdrop in patriotic imagery. Here, a young sailor and his girlfriend was staged before the tomb, suggesting their willingness to put their happiness on hold for the good of the nation. In addition, the backdrop of the tomb itself suggests that the sailor is willing to be subsumed into the whole, to give up his individual identity for the cause, even if that meant becoming an unknown casualty of war. And by the end of World War II, there were an incredible 79,000 service members unaccounted for, that is, missing in action or unidentifiable. This time, there was no debate about the need for an unknown. Indeed, it was fully expected. However, the start of the Korean conflict prevented the ceremony from going forward. Finally, in 1958, it was decided that 2 unknowns were to be selected, one to represent the losses in World War II and one the losses in Korea, and that they were to be laid to rest during the same ceremony. World War II was so large a conflict, fought on 4 continents, that the selection process happened over a number of days in a number of locations. This image shows some of the 13 flag-draped remains from Europe and North Africa gathered at Epinal American Cemetery in France. A red and white wreath was placed on the 5th casket from the left, now designated as the World War II unknown candidate from the Transatlantic Theater. 4 days later, at Hickam Air Force Base, Hawaii, a lei was placed on one of these 6 World War II remains, becoming the World War II unknown candidate from the Trans-Pacific Theater. Both World War II remains were rehoused in new caskets so that there would be no way to know which had come from the European theater and which had come from the Pacific. The day prior, also at Hickam Air Force Base, Army Sergeant Ned Lai placed his wreath on the casket to his left, selecting the Korean unknown from the 4 flag-draped candidates. Brought by plane and ship to the Atlantic coast of America, the remains were transferred to the USS Canberra for the final selection ceremony. And if you kind of look closely here, you'll see there is a line strung between both vessels with a casket swung between them. This image shows the precise maneuvering required of the Navy vessels to complete the transfers. Both ships had to be going at the same speed in exactly the same direction and keep that same gap during the whole transfer. As each casket reached the middle point between the 2 vessels, all the crew members came to attention and rendered a hand salute. An 18-year-old sailor, Tony Appel, remembered that that very moving moment, as he was crying and feeling the ship sway as it dipped in the seas during the transfer. Many of the sailors present experienced the same feelings. Then, hospital man, first class William Charette, had to select the World War II unknown. And I just want to point out what's happening. The middle casket is the Korean unknown. He's already been selected. To the left and right of him are 2 caskets containing remains from servicemen of World War II, and it is no longer possible to tell who came from the Pacific, who came from Europe. They are totally, no records, totally unknown as to their fighting area. So William Charette, after a few minutes of silent contemplation, placed a wreath at the end of the casket to the right. Shortly after the selection, the remains in the coffin to the left, the unchosen candidate from World War II, unchosen, unknown, alone, was taken by the USS Canberra 35 miles offshore and in a solemn ceremony slipped into the sea. The 2 selected unknowns were taken by the USS Blandy to Washington, D.C., guarded by both Marines and the Navy, and duplicating the World War I ceremony, the remains of the unknown were transferred from the Navy to the Army, taken to the Rotunda to lay in state, and on May 30th, Memorial Day 1958, 100,000 people lined the streets of DC, brought together in a public affirmation of national service and individual sacrifice as the funeral procession passed on its way to the amphitheater shown here at Arlington, where after his speech, President Eisenhower presented the Medal of Honor to both unknowns before they were taken to the tomb of the unknown to be laid to rest. On the left of the sarcophagus, the unknown of the Korean conflict, and to the right, the unknown of World War II. During the 50s, the tomb had become one of the historic sites visited by heads of states and other dignitaries. And I chose this picture because of its historic political significance. This is April 59, 4 months after the Cuban Revolution, when Fidel Castro visited the tomb and laid the now traditional wreath in front of the sarcophagus to show respect for the American unknowns. This evocative image seems to capture the essence of the tomb as a place of quiet reflection. It also echoes the guiding words of the tomb sentinels from the 3rd US Infantry Regiment, known as the Old Guard. Words such as duty and honor, perseverance, dignity, respect, silence. But the ever-existing tensions in American society between honoring, mourning, glorifying, or even recognizing its military dead came to a head during the Vietnam War when this picture was taken. As World War II had brought the nation together, Vietnam threatened to split it apart. Yet the power and pull of the tomb was such that Vietnam veterans wanted to see their service honored by the placing of an unknown from their conflict at the tomb. The government resisted, as it was thought that all the retrieved dead would soon be identified. In 1982, with 58,200 names of the dead and missing inscribed upon it, the Vietnam Memorial was dedicated. What the memorial did was demonstrate on the national stage the power of naming, the power of recognizing the dead, and of acknowledging the ultimate cost of war. An overwhelming sense of connection with the fallen was made here when families, friends, comrades in arms came, looked, leaned in, and finally touched the name of their beloved, of their friend, their buddy. But somehow this also highlighted the power and the pathos of the concept of an unnamed and unidentified comrade representing all. And the call for an unknown to be commemorated continued. And so, perhaps because of political pressure, on May 17, 1984, at a ceremony at Pearl Harbor, the only set of recovered remains from Vietnam not fully identified were designated as the Vietnam War unknown. The lone casket was transferred to the Navy onto the USS Bruton to be taken to California, where it was flown east from Travis Air Force Base to lie in state in the Rotunda to cross the Potomac River into Arlington, where President Reagan gave a speech in which he said, "When a serviceman dies, it is a tear in the fabric, a break in the whole, and all we can do is remember. Most of them were boys when they died, and they gave up two lives, the one they were living and the one they would have lived. When they died, they gave up their chance to be husbands and fathers and grandfathers. They gave up everything for our country, for us. And all we can do is remember." President Reagan also assured the audience that the government would still continue looking for the war's 71,000 missing in action. The unknown then received the Medal of Honor and was buried in the middle crypt between the unknowns of the Korean War and World War II. Buried, but 15 years later, exhumed, and after a DNA test on July 11, 1998, returned to his family. The wait for news of the fate of their loved one was finally over when First Lieutenant Michael Joseph Blasey, a United States Air Force pilot, shot down 60 miles north of Saigon on May 11, 1972, was buried for the final time with full military honors at Jefferson National Cemetery in St. Louis, Missouri, 26 years after he died. The Medal of Honor was removed from his service record. The debate over what to do with the now empty crypt was solved in September of '99, when it was decided to leave the crypt empty, but to place the dedication, honoring and keeping faith with America's missing servicemen, 1958-1975 was engraved on the cover. One of the main outcomes of World War I was that the United States Armed Forces learned the importance of recognizing and having empathy with the sacrifices of families and their need to know what had happened to their loved ones, how they had died, where they had fallen, and where were the remains of their loved ones now. Currently, there are still 81,600 American families who may never know what happened to their loved one. But the Army continues its mission of locating, identifying, and returning as many fallen service members as possible. This picture is of World War II soldiers recently identified by DNA testing being returned home to their families. And now that DNA samples are being taken from everyone who joins the armed forces, there may never be another unknown soldier. World War I has largely been forgotten in the American public's memory. However, the rituals and ceremonies instituted 100 years ago to honor the dead of the Great War live on today at the tomb of the unknown soldier. Dedicated at noon on November 11th, 1921, the tomb was designed to be a central place for Americans to mourn the dead and missing in action of the Great War, a response to loss on a massive scale. The tomb, along with the crypts of the World War II and Korean unknowns, and the dedication to all the missing in action, remain powerful symbols today, reflecting, as always, America's concerns with service, sacrifice, mourning, and memory, and with the need and the promise never to forget. So I invite you to join American Legion Post 77 at 11 a.m. on November 11th, 2021, to commemorate all our veterans and the 100th anniversary of the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, where Sergeant Lee Coleman, retired member of the Old Guard, shown here on duty at the tomb of President John F. Kennedy, will be the guest speaker. This has been a presentation by me, Mel Russell, of the Lest We Forget project commemorating Yolo County in World War I. And we want to thank all our supporters, Yolo County Archives particularly, and of course the Friends of the Yolo County Archives, and for today's event and the exhibit that's to come, Yolo Arts, and especially today, Knowledge at Noon. And we also want to thank you for joining us in commemorating the 100th anniversary of the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier.
Beautiful, Mel. Thank you so much. That was a wonderful honor and telling of the story of the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, and we're getting applause and many thanks coming in on the chat here. So thank you everyone for that. At this time, everyone, we will host a moderated Q&A for the talk. So if you have any questions that you would like to ask of Mel, please feel free to go ahead and type them into the chat box. I do want to start, Mel, asking, this tomb is absolutely of national importance for us and for our families of our service members, but also as citizens of the United States. But coming down to the local level here at Yolo County, why is the tomb relevant or important for us to think of and honor?
Well, the tomb is personal. You can't, it's an abstract concept, but it's like the Vietnam Memorial. When you go to the tomb, it becomes personal if you've ever lost anyone, but particularly if you've lost a service person. And so I think when we tell, this is only half of the exhibit we were going to do. The other half would be telling the stories of the boys we lost here, some of them, and how they were buried and how their particular families responded to the loss. And they looked to the government for the return of their boys and how they were given that awful decision of whether to bring the boys home or not. And it divided many, many families. Very often the mother wanted the boy here so she could go to his gravesite and mourn. And someone else within the family would say, let's leave him in France where the cemeteries will be maintained forever because families die out. But if you are buried in the Musée-Argonne, or for many people here, the D-Day cemetery, it's so moving when you go to these cemeteries, and it makes you pause and think of the actual sacrifice. So families are torn apart. So we tell that story on one of the walls of the gallery. And I should have finished by now. I try and personalize these larger ideas and sentiments by talking about how it actually impacts individual families, individual people. And how did we actually know that these were unknowns. You know, that whole story has to be told. And for this, I just did the history of the tomb. So I hope people come for the exhibit to get more of the background of our local losses.
Wonderful.
Hope that answered the question.
Absolutely. And just so everyone knows, there will be an exhibit of these photographs happening at Gallery 625 in the fall of 2022. So not this fall, but coming up next year in the fall. But we did want to commemorate the 100th anniversary as well. So in terms of your presentation, all of these, the historic photographs, for me, coming from, you know, an arts background, are particularly moving. You know, I gravitate towards visual language and visual communication. For a lot of our promotional images, and you did include the image here in the talk, we do have that image of the tomb in the winter with the soldier standing guard, and you used the phrase quiet reflection, which I had to write down. I thought it's so poignant and perfect for that photo. Can you tell us a bit more about that photograph and its relevance or significance, I guess?
Yeah, it was taken in 1966 by Carlton Sheely. And we do know the name of the guard. I'm just looking for it. I've gone blank. I should know it. If you go to any of the websites that deal with the tomb, there's lots of kinds of photos, but I always find the ones that strike me as of that individual sentinel who's doing his duty with no audience. There's nobody else looking at him. This isn't when the crowds during the summer are lined up, you know, every half hour now, waiting for this changing of the guard. No, this is a man who has chosen to dedicate himself at that point in his life to guard in the tomb, to honor the loss of America, you know, losses of America. And the photographer just caught it exactly for me. And I want to thank Carlton Sheely. I don't know, it was taken in 1966. I was scared I wasn't going to be able to contact him, but I did. And I asked him if I could use that picture. And he sent me a picture the next day, high resolution. I just was thrilled that people were still caring about the sentinels and the tomb. So yeah, I just think it reflected, there's that word again. The photo is brilliant. So he was a very, very good photographer, and many high skilled photographers choose to try and capture. It's just evocative. You're trying to capture something that's unspeakable. And you can only do things like that in music and photography and art.
Mm-hmm. So,
and I think it actually is bookended by the next picture, which is of the Vietnam Memorial, in emotion. It's the two emotions of war, but the snow in both of them just gives you a chance to pause, be silent, and listen to what those emotions and recognize what those emotions are.
Beautiful, thank you. On a similar topic, thinking about the guards and sentinels who are on duty, one of the questions that came in is, do you know how they are chosen to guard the tomb? And if all of the services are recommended or not?
No.
Represented, I'm sorry.
Yeah, represented. No. It is only Lee's gonna, let me get that page. Where did I have it? It is only the old guard. And I don't want to mess it up by giving the wrong, I've lost my page now, but it is only the old guard, which have been now evolved, but that have the honor of guarding the tomb, and it's a very intense process. And Lee, who is going to, Sergeant Lee Coleman, was the last image where we see him standing behind the Kennedy family as they're in front of John Kennedy's tomb there. is going to talk on November 11th about his experience of actually not getting chosen to be one of the sentinels of the tomb. He is an honor guard and therefore was allowed to guard John F. K's tomb, but he just couldn't quite make it to be an honor guard for the tomb. It's very, very difficult. So they go through a rigorous training and examination process. And I will get the exact title if you want to ask me another question while I go look for that info.
Sure,
and I apologize.
Sure. No problem. I understand how it goes with notes. I like to write things down, so I end up with paper everywhere.
Yes.
We do have another question asking about the site. So it is in the Arlington National Cemetery. Were there other sites that were considered besides that site,
yeah.
or is that the only one that you know of? Do you know which sites?
Yeah. Well. When I showed the amphitheater picture, I was saying a lot of cities on the East Coast. The two that jump in my memory was New York and Philadelphia. And actually, there was a very strong movement to have it, the unknown, placed in the crypt under the rotunda. That was where George Washington, they had designed that so George Washington could be buried there, but he declined. He thought it was too royalistic, I guess. And so there was an empty crypt there. And that had a lot of support. No, there was a lot of back and forth, but Arlington won out mainly because of that beautiful amphitheater having just been completed. It seemed that it would be able to hold, the crowds that were expected at different funerals, not just obviously for the unknown. It's used for any VIP that might be buried, at the. It now houses relics and artifacts, from different burials. So
beautiful.
Yeah.
Another question coming in is actually, the photos of this were incredible. But the transfer of the bodies that were done at sea, the World War II and Korea, the comment here says that it seems very precarious. It does. It seems like a very risky way to transfer the body. Do you know why they opted to do that way instead of waiting until they were docked in land or docked for a land transfer?
I can only guess. It did seem very precarious, and I actually just, you have an image of two large ships silently going through the water, but they're not silent. You would hear, the metal clanging of different things that happen on the ships, but the whole two sets of crew totally silent while they're bringing these caskets across, and they must have been holding their breath. One mistake and those wires, the tension on those wires could have pulled apart and you might have lost an unknown at sea, which I put that picture in particularly because we almost lost the first unknown at sea. And so here's what I have come to believe. I think it would have been too sensitive a political situation to be making choices between, as John Peso says from the World War I situation, it would feel like you're doing eeny, meeny, miny, mo. I'll pick that one. That is just too harsh. I don't think any society would really want to be exposed to that. And so I think the feeling was that they needed to have been selected. So the World War I one was selected in France, and World War II was, I only showed a couple of pictures. They actually had a pre-selection, of course, from Africa, another selection from Europe, and then those went to France. I mean, it was just ongoing. I think it was to avoid that sense. I find the picture of the boy being slipped into sea, he'd died with his comrades. He'd been buried near his comrades, and he had been disinterred, you know, taken across country, not picked, you know. He had actually been transferred on 2 ships because they had to do the transfer twice, and then slipped into the sea. I just feel, I just think it was a cleaner thing for American society to deal with.
Sure. Thank you for that thoughtful response. I have 2 more questions that I want to get to. I know we're getting close to time here. The first is a heavier question. The second should be a quick one for you. The racial aspects of the tomb are very interesting. Did you run across any oral histories, information, or perspectives from African Americans about their involvement?
No, I didn't, but I, as you may have noticed, made a point of placing, you know, one of the images was who actually built this tomb? Well, in those days, it was going to be African American. There's a lot written about the bigotry, prejudice during World War I. African Americans on the whole, they volunteered en masse, but they on the whole did not get to fight on the front line. So we know it, I mean, the odds of it being anyone other than a white serviceman were 0 to 0, really. And there were, I think my feeling was there were 2 points of view. Some became offended and upset because they could fully realize they weren't being recognized, but others felt that they had served and this was an unknown and the unknown could represent them. The word unknown means it's somewhat abstract. This unknown can be ours too, but it was a struggle within the community. And I would like to point out that I think that when the honor guard reflects society, and so what happens is the honor guard was all white for the longest time. But if you go today, you will see all ethnicities represented in the honor guard. You will see women. When I went, it was a woman who was in charge of the changing of the guard. So society has moved forward. But I think that was the thing, using the terms that were used, it allowed people from all ethnic backgrounds and all religious backgrounds to eventually come and accept that as representing them, I hope.
Hopefully, thank you. And finally, the ceremony on November 11th. Can you just give us the specifics of that one more time? And I'll try to type them down in the chat for everyone as you do.
Yeah. That is always held at the old courthouse in Woodland, where the county building is, in that plaza. And it's always at 11 o'clock on November 11th. It's the American Legion that does it, post 77 Woodland. And this year's speaker will be Sergeant Lee Coleman of the old guard. I'm still looking, I've gone blank, I may as well give up. Lee's there, he should type in the correct name for the regiment. 3rd Inventory, 3rd, it's gone. If you're there, Lee, type it in.
Okay, so.
And I do apologize, I should have that.
Send that to the chat.
Anyway, yes, we were going to, the exhibit, of course, was for the 100th anniversary, and we were going to have the gallery was going to be allowed to be open so that Lee would come from the American Legion ceremony and then come into the gallery and be there to answer questions. But we may come up with something different. But at the moment, at 11 o'clock, 11/11 this year.
11 a.m. on 11/11 at the old courthouse, the county administration building in Woodland, and that is on Court Street.
Correct.
Okay. All right. Well, everyone, that does conclude our event for the day. Thank you so much for your thoughtful discussions and questions in the chat. I'm so glad you were able to join us. And thank you again so much to Mel. The word in the office today is that you are a true treasure of Yolo County, and we are so glad that you are able to join us here. And to everyone else, thank you so much for logging on and for joining us. Be sure to follow us on social media on Instagram and Facebook at YOLO Arts CA to stay up to date. And we hope to see you here tomorrow at the Barn Gallery from 5:30 to 8 p.m. for the opening reception of the Art Farm show. The historic house, the Gibson House, will be open during that time as well. So if you want to come by and check out the house, we will be here. And we hope to see you guys soon and hear from you. Be sure to join us next month on October 13 to hear from our Art Farm juror and Pence Gallery Director, Natalie Nelson. She will be discussing the importance of place, art farm, and beyond.